While the world watches tech stocks and energy markets, a quiet war is being fought over the most fundamental code on Earth, the genetic blueprints of our food supply. Deep within high-security laboratories and international patent offices, massive agricultural conglomerates and elite investment funds are systematically securing exclusive patent rights to the world's crop genetics. They aren't just selling seeds. They are building a global monopoly on the traits required to grow food in an uncertain climate. And the legal system is perfectly structured to let them control the global food supply chain from the microscopic level up. For most of human history, seeds belonged to no one and everyone. A farmer in the Punjab, a grower in the Andes, a family working terrace fields in Southeast Asia. All of them saved seed at the end of each harvest, selecting the strongest plants, adapting varieties generation after generation to local soil, local rainfall, local pests. This was not a hobby. It was the entire foundation of civilization. 10,000 years of accumulated genetic knowledge passed hand to hand, free of charge, belonging to no single owner because it belonged to everyone. That world no longer exists in most of the developed agricultural economy, and it is disappearing fast everywhere else. Somewhere between the mechanization of farming in the 20th century and the biotechnology revolution that followed, seed stopped being a shared inheritance and became intellectual property. The turning point came gradually, then all at once. Hybrid seed technology in the early 20th century created varieties that would not breed true if replanted, quietly nudging farmers toward buying new seed every season instead of saving their own. Then came genetic engineering, and with it, the ability to identify, isolate, and legally claim ownership over the exact traits that make a plant valuable: drought tolerance, pest resistance, higher yield. What followed was not a natural evolution of agriculture. It was a deliberate legal transformation. Courts in the United States began recognizing that living organisms, including genetically modified plants, could be patented in the same way as a mechanical invention. Within a few decades, the same legal architecture used to protect a new smartphone chip was being applied to the wheat, corn, and soybeans that feed billions of people. The soil itself had not changed, but who was allowed to profit from what grew in it had changed completely. This is not simply the story of scientific progress. It is the story of a handful of corporations and investment funds behind them recognizing something that governments and farmers were slow to grasp: that whoever controls the genetic starting point of food controls everything downstream of it: the price, the supply, and increasingly, the terms under which people are allowed to farm at all. Patents were designed to reward invention. What has happened in agricultural genetics increasingly resembles something closer to enclosure, the fencing off of what was once common land. Except the land in question is the genetic code of the plants that feed the planet. The mechanics are straightforward once you understand them. A corporation, often backed by private equity or a specialized agricultural investment fund, identifies a naturally occurring trait in a plant variety, perhaps a gene that allows a crop to survive extended drought, or one that confers natural resistance to a particular blight. Through gene sequencing, that trait is isolated and documented. A patent application follows, sometimes for the specific genetic sequence, sometimes for the method of introducing it into a crop, and sometimes, controversially, for traits that already existed in wild or heirloom varieties long before any laboratory touched them. International patent offices, operating under frameworks like the World Intellectual Property Organization's Plant Variety Protections and TRIPS agreements, were built primarily around industrial invention, not living systems that reproduce, mutate, and spread across borders through wind, insects, and birds. This mismatch is precisely what elite agricultural investors have learned to exploit. A patent filed in one jurisdiction can be used as leverage to demand licensing fees in dozens of others, because global trade agreements increasingly require signatory nations to recognize and enforce foreign intellectual property claims, even over genetic material that traces its origins to that very nation's own farmland. The financial incentive here is staggering. A single patented trait, licensed across millions of acres of farmland worldwide, generates a recurring revenue stream that rivals pharmaceutical blockbusters, except unlike a drug patent, which eventually expires, breeding programs allow companies to stack new patented traits onto old ones, extending exclusive control indefinitely. Investment funds have taken note. Agricultural genetics is now treated by sophisticated capital as a long-duration, inflation-resistant asset class, Because no matter what happens to currencies or markets, people will always need to eat, and increasingly, they will need to pay a toll to whoever owns the code inside the seed. Perhaps no technology captures the shift from open agriculture to corporate control more starkly than what critics have labeled terminator seed technology, formerly known as genetic use restriction technology. The concept is elegant from a business standpoint and unsettling from almost every other angle. Engineer a seed so that the plant it produces is fully viable, fully productive, but genetically sterile, meaning that any seed harvested from that plant cannot itself be replanted to grow a new crop. The implications reach far beyond a single growing season. For 10,000 years, seed saving was a mechanism by which farmers maintained independence from any single supplier. If a farmer disliked a company's prices or its terms or its quality, they could simply plant last year's harvest. Terminator technology and the softer contractual versions of it that followed systematically eliminated that option. Farmers who purchase these seeds are not buying a renewable resource. They are entering a subscription. Every planting season becomes a fresh transaction, a fresh dependency, a fresh opportunity for the seed's owner to adjust pricing. Public backlash in the late 1990s and early 2000s, driven largely by farmer advocacy groups and developing nations who recognized the threat to food sovereignty, pushed several major agricultural corporations to publicly pledge they would not commercialize true terminator technology. Some of those pledges have held. But the underlying goal, permanent dependency on a single genetic supplier, has been achieved through other means. Licensing agreements now routinely include legally binding clauses that prohibit farmers from saving and replanting patented seed, regardless of whether the seed itself is biologically sterile. The contract accomplishes what the biology alone once threatened to do. Farmers who violate these agreements are not simply breaching a handshake deal. They are exposed to the same legal machinery used to prosecute corporate patent theft, an infrastructure built not around crops, but around control. Behind every patented seed lies an enforcement apparatus that operates with precision most farmers never anticipate until it arrives at their doorstep. Major agricultural biotechnology companies have historically maintained internal investigation units, staffed with former law enforcement personnel, whose job is to monitor farmland for unauthorized use of patented genetics. Field visits, aerial surveillance, and even testing of crops grown by farmers who never purchased a patented seed at all have become part of this enforcement ecosystem. The most controversial cases involve something farmers have almost no control over: cross-pollination. Wind, insects, and birds do not respect property lines or licensing agreements. Pollen from a neighboring farm planted with patented, genetically modified seed can drift for miles, settling on the crops of a farmer who never signed a single contract with a company that owns that genetic trait. When that farmer's harvest is later tested and found to contain the patented gene, the legal question becomes remarkably one-sided. In multiple documented cases across North America, farmers found themselves facing lawsuits not because they stole anything, but because their fields have been unwillingly contaminated with someone else's intellectual property, and the presence of that property, however arrived, was treated as sufficient grounds for legal action. These cases rarely make it to a public trial. The financial and legal resources available to a multinational agricultural corporation dwarf those of an independent farming operation by orders of magnitude. Most disputes are settled quietly, farmers agreeing to destroy affected crops, pay licensing penalties, or sign non-disclosure agreements, simply because the cost of fighting a company with a legal department larger than most rural courthouses is a risk few can afford to take. The result is a chilling effect that extends across entire farming regions. Neighbors of farms growing patented crops live with a persistent, quiet anxiety, knowing that a shift in the wind could expose them to legal jeopardy for a crime they never intended to commit. If patents built defenses around agricultural genetics, mergers and acquisitions have determined exactly who stands inside them. Over the past 2 decades, the global seed and agrochemical industry has undergone a consolidation so aggressive that a handful of corporate entities now control the majority of the world's commercial seed supply and the pesticides formulated specifically to work alongside their patented crops. The pattern follows familiar private equity and corporate logic. Acquire smaller regional seed companies, absorb their patent portfolios, and eliminate competition until only a small number of dominant players remain, each large enough to set pricing and licensing terms with minimal fear of being undercut. What makes this particular wave of consolidation distinct from ordinary corporate mergers is the sheer scale of what is being centralized, not factories or retail chains, but the literal genetic starting point for a substantial share of humanity's caloric intake: corn, soybeans, cotton, and canola among them. Elite investment funds, sovereign wealth vehicles, and private equity groups have been enthusiastic participants in this consolidation, recognizing that owning a controlling stake in the companies that own the patents on staple crop genetics is functionally equivalent to owning a toll booth on the global food supply chain. Unlike volatile commodity markets, licensing revenue from patented seed technology is remarkably stable and recurring, insulated from weather and largely insulated from currency shocks, because farmers in dozens of countries have no viable alternative supplier for the specific genetic traits their local climate and pest pressures now require. The fewer companies control the supply, the more predictable and profitable that toll booth becomes. The consolidation of seed genetics does not stop at corporate boardrooms. It extends directly into international diplomacy, where trade agreements have become one of the primary tools used to pressure developing nations into adopting the strict intellectual property protections that make this entire system enforceable on a global scale. Many developing economies historically operated under looser plant variety protection laws, allowing local farmers and researchers far greater freedom to save, share, and adapt seed varieties without fear of patent infringement. Bilateral and multilateral trade negotiations have systematically targeted these gaps. Access to lucrative export markets, foreign agricultural investment, or development financing is frequently conditioned on a nation adopting intellectual property standards closely aligned with those of wealthier, seed-exporting economies. Nations that resist face exclusion from trade benefits their agricultural sectors depend on, creating enormous pressure to fall in line regardless of the consequences for domestic farming communities. The results have been particularly visible across parts of Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, regions where subsistence and smallholder farming still represent the backbone of local food security. As these nations adopt stricter patent enforcement to satisfy trade partners, local farmers who have saved and shared seed variety for generations suddenly find those same practices legally restricted, replaced by licensing regimes controlled by distant multinational corporations. Critics, including numerous agricultural economists and food sovereignty organizations, argue this represents a new form of economic dependency, one where formerly self-sufficient farming nations become structurally reliant on foreign genetic suppliers for the basic ability to grow food, a dependency that can be leveraged diplomatically and economically in ways far beyond agriculture itself. Step back far enough, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. What began as a scientific breakthrough, the ability to understand and improve upon plant genetics, has evolved into one of the most consolidated and tightly controlled ownership structures in the global economy. A small number of corporations and the investment capital behind them now hold patent rights over genetic traits embedded in a substantial share of the calories consumed on this planet, enforced through legal systems, entrenched through corporate mergers, and expanded through international trade pressure. The trajectory raises a question that extends well beyond agriculture into the basic architecture of human survival. If the genetic code required to grow resilient, high-yield crops in an increasingly unstable climate becomes fully privatized, licensed, and priced according to the logic of scarcity and shareholder return, what happens to the billions of people who depend on that food chain but hold no stake in who owns it? Food security, once considered a matter of national sovereignty and basic human right, increasingly resembles a premium service. Its terms set not by governments answering to citizens, but by a small circle of corporations and capital allocators answering to shareholders. The seed in the ground has always been humanity's most basic form of security, a promise that no matter what else happens, life could be planted again next season. What is being quietly constructed today is a different kind of promise, one where that most fundamental act, grow your own food, requires a license, a payment, and permission from an owner most farmers will never meet. The soil has not changed, but the question of who truly owns what grows from it may be the most consequential economic transformation happening in the world today, and almost no one outside a handful of boardrooms is watching it unfold.